Now I'd like to talk about a new ability for 2D simulations in which you would directly use the project units from your project in the 2D calculations up until 2016 version, all previous versions that had the 2D model in it. If you were operating in US customary units, then the interface was pre-processing all of the data to metric. It was going to the analysis engine, being computed in metric, and the results were being post-processed back to US units for the presentation. This has a little bit of a caveat, or did have a little bit of a caveat, in that scenario, the raw results, the raw 2D modeling results, were essentially in metric. And so if you were to use some of the tools that are available to work with those raw results, your file data or your results would end up having been in metric, and perhaps you'd have to do some projections in GIS to get them into US units for use with per se presentation, or just integrating those results into GIS. Well, what's happened in 2016 version is we are using the ability of the 2D engine to simulate in either US or US customary, imperial if you will, units or metric units. And the switch for this is simply in the 2D job control, the clicking here, use project units for 2D engine. So if you have always been working in metric units, there's no change for you. If you tick this, it's no different, right? But if you had been doing US customary unit models, then this tick box will now allow you to essentially bypass any conversions, and the data will go directly to the 2D engine as imperial units and then computed that way, and then the results produced that way. This summarizes a little bit what I've said, right? Essentially that the internal calculations are now in, the imperial units or US customary units, if you will. The exchange between the interface and the engine has no conversion now. And when you are dealing with, say, the utilities, the 2D utilities to extract grids, for example, from the model results, then it's going to be able to do it in US units if the results are in US units. So this is quite a good enhancement that we've been able to make. Just as a little bit of evidence, I went into the log file, the TLF file, and there's a section called Geographic Reference Commands, and you'll notice in here that it says units equals English, and there's a little exclamation here, output to be in the same units as the input. So if you're trying to confirm that if this actually worked, or you want to look at a previous model and you look in the 2Flow log file, the TLF file, you'll be able to confirm, well, was this run in which sets of units? In metric, where the interface pre-processed everything, or was it run in English units? I've paired with this discussion another one about directly creating ASCII grid results. There's a section, let me just back up my slides a little bit. There's a section in the 2D job control called Advanced Settings. These advanced settings include the ability to enter specific commands, and the ones that I think would be of interest to you is that you can create your map output into one or more, several different types. The default is XMDF file. I believe it was the 2014 version or 2013 version where we switched from DAT files to XMDF files, but it's also possible to make grids, binary float files, and ASCII grids. Another command that could be entered into the 2D advanced settings is that you want to use the grids just to capture the maximum and the minimums only. And so that to-flow command, if you will, or that command that goes to the engine, is maximums and minimums only for grids equals on. What does it look like when you put it into the software? Well, as I mentioned, you go to the advanced settings. The flag here makes it enabled or disabled, and you put in the parameter. If you will, this equals equals, which is sort of like the text part of how it could be written if you were using the 2D engine raw without an interface. That disappears, and then you just put the values. So I've created a model simulation yesterday where I put in map output format, XMDF, which is the default, but I also want the ASCII grid because I want to have the analysis create the file that I'll take to GIS directly without having to go to the utilities or do an export from the layer, etc. And I've chosen that the maximums and minimums only for the grids to be on. So I'm going to have my binary results for all the time series as a XMDF file, and I'm going to have a grid file for the max and the minimum, which I can just directly open in GIS. When you do this, and you're using the folders to specify where all the 2D input and output will go, it will create a grids folder, and that grids folder will then have all of your max and mins, your ASCII grids, which you can take and directly open in GIS or create exhibits. Here I have taken the ASCII grid for the maximum depth, and I've opened it up into QGIS. I suppose, it could be any GIS, but I happen to use one that's fairly generic. And so I've got that ASCII grid directly opened into QGIS without having to do any special export from XP. So essentially what I'm saying is you don't need to export your results if you are already telling it to create the envelope of maximums. Let's go a little bit live software demo so I can discuss these items that I've just been explaining. So the first thing that I had mentioned is about the project units. So the units are specified under configuration units. If you switch your project units, for example, you need to realize that this only changes the interpretation of the values. Where, for example, where I had a value of, let's just go to this link, where I have a value of 115.85, that number is never changed. This would be 115.85 meters or feet, depending on the project units. But anyway, it draws from your setting of the units, and then in the 2D job control, there's a tick box to say use project units for the 2D engine. That's all it takes, and of course, if your project is metric, there's really no difference. Your input and output will all be metric. However, if it's US units, then now in 2016 it will compute with US unit input. There won't be any pre-processing by the graphical user interface before it goes to the 2D engine and starts doing the solving. The item about the advanced settings, here it is, 2D job control advanced settings. These are the items that I had mentioned in my PowerPoint. You choose the insert button to make more rows. The flag here will toggle it on or off. And the main one is of course map output format being both. But this one is really paired well since typically in the ASCII grid result I really probably only want the maximum. I don't want every time step stored into a new ASCII grid. But if I did, feel free to have have this, be on or off appropriately and turned on or turned off appropriately with the flag. I did this earlier, so of course I'll save you the time of solving the model, and it takes a few minutes, but I don't want you to sit and wait for a result for a few minutes. And here's the ASCII grid result being displayed in QGIS. So that was pretty easy. I'm not trying to specifically teach you QGIS, but I just added a raster layer, and I chose the ASCII grid, say the D for depth, or the H is the elevation ASCII grid, etc. And then opened it and zoomed, etc. And I've got that result displayed in GIS without having to say what previously people would be doing is perhaps right-clicking on a layer that they're displaying and then exporting the results to ESRI Grid or maybe even a shapefile, and then going into GIS with those exports. But we're just going to directly write them. So these are both enhancements, I suppose, in time, but I feel like it's even more than that in that there's no conversion that's going on, and you can directly use the project units.